This is Censor Studio, always biting the wall of the times. Right now, the whole world is buzzing. That's because there's hope that the war in Ukraine is finally coming to an end. Amid analyses suggesting that the war in Ukraine could soon reach a ceasefire, President Trump and President Zelensky met at the White House on August 18 local time. Today, we'll be taking a closer look at this topic. Let's get right into it. On the 18th, President Trump and President Zelensky met again at the White House after 6 months to discuss ending the war in Ukraine. Many top European leaders also went to the United States at this time. They were not able to participate in the bilateral talks between Ukraine and the United States, so they held separate meetings instead. President Trump met with President Zelensky of Ukraine at the White House that day, and the meeting was much friendlier than before. Back in February, they exchanged harsh words, and the meeting was held in a very tense atmosphere, but this time, both sides maintained a friendly atmosphere. The United States promptly told reporters that Ukraine is the first line of defense and affirmed its support for Ukraine, and President Trump said that the war would end soon. President Zelensky of Ukraine often thanked the United States and President Trump. The biggest issues in this meeting were, above all, how to determine the ceasefire line and how to guarantee Ukraine's security. President Zelensky of Ukraine stressed the urgent need for a strong military with weapons, troops, training, and intelligence to ensure Ukraine's security. He added that all these elements depend on the support of key allies like the United States. There were also discussions about territory. Currently, Ukraine and Russia have very different ideas. Ukraine believes that the ceasefire line should be drawn based on the current front line, while Russia thinks that the entire Donbas region should be handed over. There is a big difference in views between the two sides. As a result, territorial issues weren't addressed immediately and are expected to be discussed later if a United States-Russia-Ukraine summit occurs. President Trump said the territorial issue is for President Zelensky, Ukraine's people, and President Putin to decide during negotiations. We must closely monitor the territorial issue as Russia now occupies about 20% of Ukraine. Russia controls roughly 99% of Luhansk, 76% of Donetsk, 73% of Zaporizhia, and 70% of Kherson. Russia controls 88% of Donbas and demands the remaining 12% be given to them. After the United States-Russia summit, there was discussion about securing Ukraine with European troops in exchange for Ukraine giving up the Donbas region. Of course, the Donbas region is extremely important for Ukraine, and if another war breaks out in the future, it could serve as a route for advancing toward Kiev, so from Ukraine's perspective, it's a very difficult region to give up. Russia has indicated that if Ukraine gives up Donbas, they might return controlled areas like Sumy or Kharkiv. However, these areas are less valuable strategically than the Donbas region. Russia has stated that if these conditions are met, they could freeze the current front line in the southern region. There have been many talks on security guarantees for Ukraine, and reports indicate the United States, Ukraine, and Europe were satisfied. Currently, the most likely scenario is that Ukraine will not join NATO, but will still receive military support from NATO member countries. Recently, Steve Witkoff, the special envoy, mentioned in an interview with Cable News Network that the United States could provide Ukraine with protection similar to NATO's Article 5 collective defense. He also said that this protection would be provided directly by the United States and other European countries, not by NATO itself. President Trump also expressed his willingness to protect Ukraine, saying that lasting peace would be achieved and that the United States would take a direct role in protecting Ukraine with a NATO-style security guarantee. President Trump met with President Zelensky of Ukraine and later spoke with European leaders. 7 key European leaders attended the meeting: Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz, France's President Emmanuel Macron, United Kingdom Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, Finland's President Alexander Stubb, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. At this meeting, President Trump told reporters that they would discuss who would do what regarding security guarantees for this year. President Trump did not rule out the possibility of deploying United States troops to Ukraine to maintain ultimate peace. President Trump said the United States would support Ukraine however possible. Europe seemed to be trying its best to get Ukraine to accept a NATO-style agreement. European leaders emphasized the importance of security guarantees, noting that Russia could launch another attack. European leaders reiterated that a ceasefire is essential. Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, said in his opening remarks that our credibility today relies on achieving a ceasefire to begin serious negotiations. He added that everyone wants a ceasefire. There were several interesting moments. President Trump reportedly left his meeting with European leaders for 40 minutes to call President Putin. According to the German Daily Bild, President Trump abruptly interrupted his meeting with European leaders at the White House to have a phone call with President Putin of Russia. Russia said President Trump requested the call to speak directly with President Putin and encourage direct talks with Ukraine. Reportedly, following this call, Ukraine and Russia agreed to appoint higher-level negotiators. Russia and Ukraine's leaders are expected to meet within 14 days. The meeting location isn't decided yet, but it's expected to be a symbolic place. It seems that this is the first time in a while that Ukraine, Europe, and the United States are all satisfied with the talks. The international community appears to be moving toward NATO-style security guarantees for Ukraine, which would partly address Ukraine's security concerns. Since it isn't legally binding, unexpected issues could arise, but Ukraine can't afford to be selective. The territorial dispute remains unresolved, as Ukraine and Russia have major differences, so significant challenges are expected. However, since Ukraine is expected to receive security guarantees, many experts believe that Ukraine's concession on the territorial issue is inevitable. Most ceasefire details are expected to be settled at the upcoming trilateral meeting between the United States, Russia, and Ukraine, likely within 2 weeks. If the war in Ukraine reaches a ceasefire, some peace may temporarily return to Europe. However, what we need to pay attention to now is the domestic political impact. The ceasefire negotiations impact not only the international stage, but also have major effects on domestic politics in Ukraine and Russia. First, let's take a look at the situation in Ukraine. If President Zelensky agrees to give up territory, he may face major backlash at home. The Ukrainian constitution emphasizes territorial integrity, so if the government gives up land, it may undermine its constitutional legitimacy. The sentiments of the Ukrainian people are also complicated. Over the past 3.5 years, countless young people have lost their lives on the front lines, and cities and towns have been devastated. Now, they're being told to give all of Donbass to Russia. Those who lost family, refugees fleeing home, and frontline soldiers are likely deeply angered. The opposition will likely pressure the Zelensky government, accusing them of selling out territory and calling the negotiations humiliating. In fact, within Ukrainian politics, there is already a fierce debate between those who insist on not giving up any territory and those who argue for a realistic compromise. Even if President Zelensky ends the war, he will still face a risky political future. Now, let's examine Russia's situation. Why is Putin considering a ceasefire? Russian society is struggling under the prolonged, increasingly unbearable war. 3.5 years since the war began, the Russian economy has been severely weakened by sanctions from all sides. Thanks to energy exports, Russia is holding out in the short term, but parts needed for advanced technology and weapons production are becoming increasingly scarce. The defense industry is booming, but the civilian sector is stagnant and prices keep rising. They're sacrificing their future for war. A bigger problem is the loss of troops. Experts estimate hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers have died, with growing movements resisting conscription and reports of rising public dissatisfaction with the ongoing war, though no official announcement has been made. President Putin still runs a strong authoritarian regime. As time passes, more people question when the war will end and why their sons must die on the front lines, creating a burden for President Putin. In the end, President Putin may have judged that it would be more advantageous to declare a ceasefire now and promote the achievements he has gained. In other words, in Ukraine, giving up territory could lead to a domestic political crisis, while in Russia, delaying a ceasefire could result in an explosion of internal discontent. Therefore, both leaders are in a desperate situation where they must gain something from these negotiations. We'll have to wait and see what happens next, but understanding this kind of political logic to some extent will help us better understand the situation going forward. What do you all think about the current situation in Ukraine? Please leave your thoughts in the comments. That's the end of the video. Thank you.